Hello and welcome to Corpse Club, the official podcast of DailyDead.com. I'm one of your co-hosts, Bryan Christopher, and alongside me is Jonathan James. And today I am very excited because we are actually going to get back to something that we first mentioned during our year why am I forgetting the word here, Jonathan? New Year's resolution. That's the word. Yes. So we made some resolutions at the end of last year related to horror. And one for me was that I was very excited to do a full Hellraiser franchise retrospective. And we're going to kick that off today, but we are going to do things a little bit differently because obviously we're not the first ones to ever do a Hellraiser retrospective. But the thing that always seems to happen is everybody's very happy and gung-ho when they get started with the highs that are the originals, the first couple. By the time they get to the end of this franchise, everybody seems very sad and doesn't want to do it anymore. So I'm going to get those out of the way first, and we're going to do a different format. Think of it as a Dante's Divine Comedy, and we're going to do three stages. We're going to do three plays here. We're going to do Inferno, which is going to be Hellseeker through Judgment, which we'll be doing today. Then our next episode will be Hellraiser 3, 4, and 5. So that'll be up through Inferno, and then we'll get up into Paradise, where we will do the first two Hellraiser films. So, Jonathan, this one's is this your favorite horror movie as well, in addition to mine?
It definitely is it's in the top 10. Okay. Sometimes it always fluctuates.
Yeah, it always depends on, the day you ask. But so we're going to start off, like I said, with Inferno. But if we're going to do a good Dante analogy, then we need a Virgil, because I think if we're going to talk about a series of movies that are steeped in queer elements and BDSM elements, I don't think you really just want two vanilla straight guys talking about them the whole time. So we brought in some help. We have two guides for us throughout this journey that we're going to take. The first of which from the Horror Queers podcast, Joe Lipsett. How you doing, Joe?
I'm well. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to represent the queer side, not so much the BDSM side.
Yes, for the BDSM side, we have another person here. We have Annie Rose Malamet from the Girls, Guts, and Giallo podcast. How you doing, Annie?
Hi, I'm good.
Welcome to you.
I'm here. I'm gay. I'm kinky. You want to tell me a little bit, Joe, first about Horror Queers and some of the other work that you're doing in the horror genre?
Absolutely. So Horror Queers is a queer podcast. So we look at either queer horror films or films through a queer lens. And I do that with my co-host, Trace Thurman. We're both writers for Bloody Disgusting. And it's a weekly podcast, comes out every Wednesday. And we have a lot of fun. And more or less, we've become increasingly vulgar over the last year and a half since we started doing it.
Lowlifes. It's a great show. If you haven't listened to it yet, definitely recommend checking it out. Annie, how about you?
Yeah, Girls Guts Giallo is a podcast about subversive and controversial film from a leather dyke perspective. So a lot of horror films tend to fall under that umbrella of subversive and controversial. So I do talk a lot about horror films, but it's not strictly a horror podcast. That's what I do over there. And
you really do bring a lot of interesting perspective. You just did an episode on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, something that I feel like in a lot of cases has been talked to death, but you really brought something fresh to it in terms of kind of bringing in the disabled and trans discussion to the movie, and really brought in some things I wasn't even thinking about. So it's going to kind of give me a fresh set of eyes to see it with next time I check it out.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's what I always try to do. I'm a leather, like I said, a leather dyke. So I'm a BDSM lifestyle gay woman, and I'm a former sex worker. So I got lots of interesting things to say, I think. So yeah, check it out.
Awesome. So I want to just kind of go around the table to kick things off and talk about what our introductions were to the Hellraiser franchise. I'll start off. For me, it's a movie that kind of goes back as far as my memory does. My mom being a really big horror fan, and also being really kind of fast and loose with the rules of what a young child should be watching, didn't really mind having me in the room at like 3, 4, maybe 5 years old when she was watching Hellraiser. And it's something that of course, scared the hell out of me as a small child, but it also, like even from the early days of seeing it, it captivated me. And I think it was kind of for the more basic level stuff. I was, even as a little kid, I was really into like gory movies and stuff like that. And, you don't get much gorier than Hellraiser, but it's kind of been an evolution for me over the years where the interest for me in at least the original has evolved just because of picking up more about what it's really about. It's not as much necessarily about the Cenobites as it is about, Julia and Frank's story. And it's just something that every time I go back to it, it's such a simple story, but it's also such a nuanced and sophisticated story that it never, ever gets old for me. And it's probably why it's, my favorite movie. I guess let's swing to our guests next. Annie.
Yeah, so my mom was the same way. I was able to watch pretty much anything growing up, so I relate to that. But the first time I saw Hellraiser was probably in high school, and I fell in love with it immediately. It's one of my all-time favorite horror films, and it was a big sexual awakening for me when I saw that movie when I was in high school. So I'm excited to talk about the whole entire series.
All right, great. So Joe, how about you? What was your introduction to the franchise?
So Hellraiser is probably one of my all-time favorite horror films, but it's also one of the most seminal because my introduction to horror was really through my sister at around age 10, and she did a Clive Barker double bill. So I watched Candyman and Hellraiser in the same night, and it's really shaped who I am in terms of not just like a queer sexuality, because Clive Barker, I think, brings so much to that in his adaptations and his work, but also just the level of sophistication that I've come to want and crave from horror films. So I regard the Hellraiser franchise, I mean, I have a very soft spot for the first 2 films, but I really like the adultness of this franchise, even in some of these lesser iterations.
Fantastic. And Jonathan?
Yeah, it's interesting because I knew we were going to talk about this, and I can't actually pinpoint. There's no pun intended there. I can't actually pinpoint when the first time was I saw Hellraiser, but I remember when I was younger just seeing like the commercials on TV, and I think the original assumption, which a lot of people have, is that Pinhead is a slasher, same as like, Freddy or Michael Myers. And so when I show people that, even just, last year, they were like, it was very different than I was expecting. And so I remember that, that's kind of what left the lasting impression on me, which is like, this is not what I was expecting, not what I was prepared for. And I really love it. And I think also part of that was, just being really just amazed, and it's like it kind of like opened a new world for me, not just this movie but the work of Clive Barker. And I really got into the books of blood when I was younger, probably way too young I guess for most people, but I just ate all that stuff up, and I've been a fan ever since.
All right. We're going to, we're talking about, most of us, our entry point was the original. And so we're going to jump way ahead to the not so great entries. And we're, like I said, right now we're kind of in the Inferno. So we're in hell. And when I say hell, I mean, these are all, we're talking about Hellseeker through Judgment. And these are 5 films that are generally seen as pretty much the worst the franchise has to offer, and are kind of seen as the biggest drop in quality for any franchise. Pretty much any franchise goes on long enough, it's going to start to dip. But even more so than Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, any of those other franchises, Hellraiser is really seen as kind of a fall from grace with its final set of installments. And part of that is because of the direct-to-video boom that started when Miramax kind of kicked things off with Inferno, and just started taking the unrelated scripts that weren't originally Hellraiser stories and just kind of cramming Pinhead and the Lament configuration into them. Or as we'll see in one of the movies, the Lamont configuration, because apparently that's what they decided to call it. So what we're going to do is just kind of go through first a bit of a rapid fire of each movie. I'm going to give some of the basics, the synopsis, actors, all that good stuff. And then we'll talk about it a little bit. Like I said, I'm guessing it's not going to be super complimentary, but, might get some surprises as we go through. And then we'll kind of have a discussion about the movies as a whole and just kind of see why they regarded the way they are. So that's going to kick us off with Hellraiser Hellseeker from 2002, directed by Rick Boda. You're going to hear that name come up a couple more times. Starring Ashley Lawrence, Dean Winters, and, of course, Doug Bradley as Pinhead. The synopsis, a shady businessman attempts to piece together the details of the car crash that killed his wife, rendered him an amnesiac, and left him in possession of a sinister puzzle box that summons monsters. I'm just going to say this up front. I actually hate this movie with a passion.
I hate the Allstate insurance guy.
Dean Winters. You're not a fan of mayhem in this movie, huh? I will say I'm actually, as an actor, I love Dean Winters. I loved him in Oz. He's one of the great kind of like scumbaggy kind of guys in 30 Rock as Dennis Duffy. But there is nothing he can do to save this movie.
Oh, no.
It is dull. And I know, Jonathan, we wanted to try and be respectful, but like this one it's hard for me.
It's because it's so boring. It's that so boring.
And it's also the turn they take at the end. Part of me is a little mad about what they did with the Kirsty Cotton character in terms of kind of throwing her under the bus in terms of like just kind of throwing 5 people to the wolves. Now, granted, it was 5 people who weren't very great, but anybody who's seen this movie, the ending of this movie, and big spoiler alert blanket, because we're going to be talking about spoilers up and down through all these movies. But the movie ends up where Dean Winters' character has gone through thinking the whole time that Kirsty Cotton had died in a car wreck. Turns out he was the one who died because through some comings and goings, he got her to open the puzzle box. And as one last bargain, she got the Cenobites to agree to take him and 4 of his friends rather than take her. And there was part of me that was mad that they did that with Kirsty Cotton's character, but I don't know. I guess I can kind of see that. What I'm more upset with is A, that she opened the box in the first place. There wasn't anything that said she had to open it. And B, that Pinhead was so quick to take that deal. That was the most insulting thing to me. So this is a demon that has been after her for, I guess at this point, like 15, almost 20 years. And he finally has her where he wants her. And she goes, well, how about these 5 randos instead? He goes, yeah, that sounds good to me. That just does not ring as a good ending for a Hellraiser movie to me.
Well, what's interesting is that so I have the pleasure of owning this movie as a DVD. So there is a extended sequence where Pinhead and Kirsty talk. So there is a little bit more background, a little bit more bargaining. So it does feel a bit more authentic. But this is also a rewrite from Clive Barker. He was given the opportunity to see a working print or a working draft of the script, and he suggested that they go with this kind of ending. Originally, it was going to be a lot more Kirsty versus Pinhead. So this is actually dialed back from what I think could have been.
And I did read that this is Barker's favorite entry since Hellbound. Respectfully disagree, but that's if he enjoys it, then that's great. Jonathan, what's your take on this one?
I mean, I think a theme you're going to hear from me for probably every one of these movies is there's some decent story elements, like with other, with different hands, with a different budget, we could maybe make that story work, right? Like conceptually, like I'm okay with that Kirsty, is kind of tricked by this guy she meets, falls in love. He, acquires a puzzle box, and his goal is to get her to open it. Like I can imagine that being a story, and then she has to make a deal to kind of undo that. But I don't like that we got it just at the end. I think one of the big changes that we see when this moved to Dimension, I mean, at least to the DTV versions, is like, is this reality? And we didn't need that. That wasn't really that big of a concept in the originals and in the first four. They really only kind of got into that once we hit Inferno, which is, am I alive or am I not? Is this a dream or is it not? And they really leaned into that pretty heavily here. So, I mean, certainly this is not a great movie. I would say this is my least favorite of the movies we're going to discuss today.
Yeah, I completely agree with that statement. This is actually my second least favorite of the entire franchise. The other one, unfortunately, we won't get to talk about tonight, so I'll have to wait until next month.
Really? Okay, well, that narrows it down.
I think for me, maybe, Brian, this will help to address your complaint. So originally they had written this for Kirsty, but then they weren't able to get Ashley Lawrence. So this was just going to be some wife character. So originally the bartering, I think, would have worked a little bit better because you wouldn't have had questions about, well, why would she open the box? She knows this. And then, of course, they got her at the last minute because Doug Bradley got a hold of her. But because it was so late, they could only do some cursory rewrites to make it fit Kirsty. And as a result, I don't think it plays as well as it could. I think my big issue with this is very similar to what Jonathan said, which is that there's an interesting premise, but so much of this is just dedicated to the boring mundaneness of, is he alive? Is he dead? What's really happening? And if you look back to what made the first four films striking, is that it was the real world. Always. There was very little hallucinations. And by going into this realm where we're not really sure, I think it takes away from the scariness of what these creatures are bringing to the table.
Agreed. Annie, haven't heard from you on this one. I know you must be raring to go with something on this one.
I mean, I think the biggest thought I have is really for the whole, all of the movies we're talking about in this episode, which is that I think, Pinhead goes from being this like kind of sexy esoteric sadist to just like a bloodthirsty slasher, and which I think is completely not the draw of Hellraiser, which, like you guys were saying, they really lean into that in these last movies for some reason, which doesn't make any sense because that's not why you like Hellraiser. So this one is kind of I think like the most boring one, like you said, that we're talking about in this episode. It's just not, I mean, I guess I'm just going to have to like lean into being a pervert in this because I feel like part of what is so unsuccessful about this movie in particular, and less so maybe the other ones we're going to talk about, is it's not sexy.
It's not sexy.
Yeah.
It's super moralistic too. Like it's actually going the opposite way of what you would expect Hellraiser to do.
Yes.
And it's weird, too, because they try and throw in a few like S&M elements. Like you get the sense that the affairs he's been having involve like some quote unquote kink. But it's like the kind of stuff that like makes 50 Shades of Grey seem like over the top. So it's just
like people who don't know anything about that,
absolutely,
what they would think would be salacious.
Yeah, the kinkiest thing about this movie is the price of the chair that he's having sex with that woman.
Okay. All right. So I think we've said what we need to say about Hellseeker. So let's move on to 2005's Deader, directed, surprise, surprise, Rick Boda once again, starring Carrie Werr, Paul Reese, Simon Coons, and again, Doug Bradley as Pinhead. Synopsis: a journalist uncovers an underground group who can bring back the dead and slowly becomes drawn into their world. Now, this was one of the big ones that this was not written as a Hellraiser Hellraiser property originally. This was converted from a different script, or at least a spec from a script. And it also is the first of two films that were filmed at the same time. This one and the next one, Hellworld, were filmed in Romania. So at this point, we're kind of really getting into the let's just turn these around and churn them out kind of style. This one for me wasn't so much angering as Hellseeker, but it was, and admittedly, I was kind of like neck deep in these movies. I think this is the second to last one I watched. I didn't watch them in order. So by this point, I was pretty tapped out. So it was having difficulty keeping my attention. But it is one that I could see if they hadn't tried to cram in the Hellraiser elements and had tried to just take it in its own direction, could have been an interesting movie. But you spend too much time wondering or noticing the scenes where they clearly had to jam in Hellraiser elements. So, it's not offensively bad, but it's also just kind of there for me. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on this one?
I completely forgot to call you out, so I'm just going to take a break from talking about these movies individually to call you out because
I can't wait.
I had to spend $6 for almost all of these movies on Amazon. And part of it's your fault, Brian. Part of it's mine, and I guess my fault is
hold on.
Yeah,
six each.
Yeah, because that's what it was on Amazon.
No, I spent $4 on each of them.
Well, I don't. Did you do the SD ones?
No.
What happened to me over here? How did I spend $2 extra?
I don't know, but we're all sending you invoices.
Yeah, so I'm sending you an invoice. No, mine were like, I swear, I'm going to go back and look. Mine were like $5.99. It was like did you rent them or did you buy them?
I rented them.
Oh, see, so this is.
Are you the proud owner?
Yeah, so this is what I was going to say, right? Part of it's your fault, Brian, but part of it's mine because I thought about it. I'm like, well, I had them on DVD, but they were buried somewhere. So this is even worse. But I'm like, I need to see them in high definition. I thought I did anyway. Oh, no. And then I'm like, well, for an extra $1, I could own this in case I ever want to see it again. And then as I was watching it, I realized I've made a mistake. And then I repeated that mistake again and again. So anyway. I forgot to call you out for that, but and myself, I guess, at the same time. But back to the topic at hand, Deader. It's the same thing as kind of I was mentioning before. I think there's some cool elements, maybe a little like Midnight Meat Train plus Hellraiser. I like the investigative side, right? Like let's investigate people who have been affected or who have like encountered the Cenobites and. How they deal with that. I think it also kind of deals with the am I dead or not in a more interesting way where you see these people who they convince are really dead and kind of force them to kill themselves. So I think there's some interesting things there. It's just, again, they don't have the budget. They don't necessarily have the talent there. And so we get this movie. So yeah, that's what I got to say about this one. But this one, I'd say this one for a DTV movie, it's passable. It was certainly better than Hellseeker. Even though now I own it, I don't think I need to see it again. But I own it. I have it on my Amazon list.
Annie, how about you? Any thoughts for you on this one?
Yeah, this is my favorite of the ones that we're talking about today. I really like the main character. I'm just looking at the actress's name again. What is it? Ali Wooher? Carrie Wooher, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, she kind of reminds me of like the Hellraiser franchise's answer to Ashley Judd circa early 2000s.
Yes.
And I like her in this. I think she's really hot. I really like her outfits. And I also like that weird sex train. Like that, I needed more of the sex train. I thought every scene on the train was actually very good. So I was into that, but yeah, other than that, I mean, it's not saying a ton that this is what I think the best of the ones that we're talking about today, but I do think it has some interesting elements.
All right. And Joe?
So I went into this one thinking that it was going to be my favorite of this batch, and unfortunately it fell a little bit in that regard because I found the nature of her hallucinations to be a little bit monotonous. Like they just kind of all blend together over time. I will agree with Annie. I love the train stuff. I think the costuming is kind of interesting. It is very 2005. I mean, probably 2002, and then released in 2005. My big A plus of this film is Whir. I think she's great. I've enjoyed her work in a bunch of other things from Sliders and Anaconda. So I can't also help but feel like it's a mistake for all these other films to do away with a strong female lead, because that's one of the big anchors of the early entries. Yes. So it's disappointing that this is the only one we're going to be talking about tonight with even a small female presence. Like I know Judgment has a female cop in it, but F off.
Right.
I think of all the people who are taking it the most seriously, and honestly, that's including Doug Bradley. I think Carrie Whir is the one who leans the most into kind of really giving an actual performance in these movies. And she definitely has to carry Deader. And, as much as she possibly can, she definitely does. I
do like the idea of the cult as well. I think there's a lot of potential in it. I know that this is a bit of tried and true formula for different horror franchises. But in this case, the idea of a cult thinking that they could reach that sort of nebulous zone is really fascinating. And I wish that they had spent more time with that as opposed to, she's got some sad backstory with her dad and trauma, especially since this is yet another film that takes pleasure in a woman's traumatic history, but doesn't give it any kind of due. Like they're not really interested in investigating that. They're just saying, this is your backstory. And that's shit.
Yeah. I don't like how the men in Hellseeker and the other, the one that we're going to talk about next time. I get a lot. I get them confused. I'll be honest.
Because Hellseeker and Inferno are more or less the same film.
Yes. Yeah. Inferno. Yeah. I don't like how, this is one of my big gripes with horror films in general. I don't like how men just get to be callous assholes, but women don't get to be assholes. Why couldn't she just?
Annie, you all need to be vulnerable because that's what real life is like, right?
Right. How come those guys get to just be kind of jerks who are just seeking some pleasure principle, and the women have to be these traumatized damsels. They would only be so fucked up if something terrible had happened to them. So it's obnoxious and moralistic, and again, not what Hellraiser is about for me.
Unfortunately, I think it's one of the issues that this franchise has, overall, over all 10 entries, is that there is a lack of female contributions to the creative team. And unfortunately, I don't know if we're going to talk about the movie or the TV show, but that's something that I'm not seeing in these announcements. And I don't understand why women and queers, frankly, are not being consulted for this franchise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about, we'll probably get into the weeds on the future of the Hellraiser franchise as part of the last entry. But yeah, that definitely is an issue, and one that doesn't seem like it's going to be going away anytime soon.
No, unfortunately.
So plugging along, we're now on to another 2005 entry, Hellworld. As I said, this one was shot simultaneously pretty much with Deader, just because I think to shoot the first one in Romania, they were contractually obligated to shoot the next one in Romania. So I think we just did it all at the same time. Once again, Rick Boda in the director's chair. This will be the last one he's in on, starring Lance Henriksen. There we go. Catherine Winnick, Christopher Jacot, Superman, and Doug Bradley. So the synopsis for this one is gamers playing an MMORPG based on the Hellraiser films find their lives endangered after being invited to a rave, the host of which intends to show them the truth behind the Cenobite mythos, which I think that was the most early 2000s sentence that's ever been uttered. So yeah, this one, I think
what
this
do we
one's
say
fun.
about Hellworld?
this one is fun. It's got like the same way I'm going to talk about Bloodline in our next episode is kind of the same way I'm going to talk about Hellworld, but just kind of on a lower tier. Because I'm not going to pretend that Hellworld is anywhere near as good as Bloodline. And I know that's even a controversial thing to say Bloodline's any good, but we'll get into that later.
Hey, watch yourself.
But it's so ridiculous and it goes so far around the bend that it can't help but be entertaining, even while it just I just commend its ability to completely throw any sense of logic out the door. There is stuff in this that no matter how you look at it is not conceivably possible, magic or not, or drugs or not. And I do think that it's important to kind of, for those who haven't seen Hellworld, the basic premise is that, or the reveal at the end is that it's not really the Cenobites who are behind any of this. It's this group of kids. One of them had committed suicide before the start of the movie, and the father, played by Lance Henriksen, is getting revenge, and he uses some very convoluted method of drugging them, burying them, giving them cell phones in order to induce hallucinations through suggestion. But at the same time, they're also able to put together clues that they couldn't possibly have access to because they're buried underneath 6 feet of dirt. There's just a lot of funky stuff going on. Oh, and then at the end, he does open up the box and he gets killed by the Cenobites. Because why not? But it's one of those movies where similar to another one of my franchise favorites from Friday the 13th, The New Blood, it's just so unabashed and it's we don't give a shit that there's something that I respect about it because it just gets so nutty. Annie, I'd be interested to hear your first takes on this one.
Oh God, the first thing that came to my head was I liked the blowjob scene. That was funny. It looked like it was a great blowjob. So that's really my contribution to Hellworld. Also, kind of remind me of that D. Snyder movie, Strangeland. That just the terrible, clunky early 2000s internet stuff combined with the pseudo BDSM elements. So, which I can appreciate for the camp factor. So those are my thoughts on Hellworld.
Well, and a funny story about the blowjob scene is obviously there's not much to describe. It's one of the characters actually. It's Superman. He spends part of the movie getting filleted in the middle of a party, and I at one point had to pause the movie just at that point, and I walked away from my computer, and then while I'm walking away, my wife walks up to it, and I come back and I just had this inquisitive look, and she's just pointing at the screen, doesn't even say anything, but just has that look on her face what the hell is this?
You're watching porn, aren't you?
I would actually be less embarrassed to say I was watching porn.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So yeah, Jonathan, what are your thoughts on Hellworld?
I sound like a broken record, but if this were made in the 1980s, I can imagine a fun we're going to this Pinhead's haunted house and watch what happens. And if this were made now, I could imagine it being this is an immersive experience. It's like Hellraiser. So I think that you could have a lot of fun with this story, and it seems like they are having some fun with this one. It's not a great movie. It's not executed well, but like I said, I always find the concepts are okay. And it's got Lance Henriksen. I'm a sucker for aliens. So it's this one ranks higher among these movies for me because I think it's a little more rewatchable. Whereas Hellseeker to me is just slow. Whereas there's enough to kind of keep me entertained here. It's definitely, it feels even though I don't think it came out in time to be Saw inspired, depending on how quickly, because they shot these things quickly. It could have been, but it feels they amped up the gore factor here. And obviously, the pseudo or drug induced Pinhead is a slasher here, which is just so far away from, the Pinhead that we, all know and love. So I think that's kind of one of the tough things about this. Yeah. But I don't know. I to me, like I said, I think this one just stands out because of how crazy it is, and I also think it's kind of fun to see like Henry Cavill, and then also there's Kari Payton from The Walking Dead in this as well as one of the other characters. So anyway, I think I could rewatch this one and survive.
An interesting note about Kari Payton and Lance Henriksen is that they both were cast by happenstance because they just happened to be in Romania after wrapping up other direct-to-DVD movies that they had just been doing. So Kari had just been doing, I think, Dracula 2 Ascension, and I think Henriksen had just been doing Mimic 3. Both were being shot in Romania. So
both classics.
Yes. Which, by the way, that's going to be the next retrospective we're doing. You're both locked in for that, I assume, right, Annie and Joe?
Oh my God.
Mimics and the Dracula movies? Because I think we should do both.
Okay,
time. Yes.
Holy
Joe, thoughts on Hellworld?
So this was a first-time watch for me. This was a gap in my knowledge of the franchise, and maybe for that reason, it ended up landing better than expected. This ended up being the top film of the 5 that we watched for this. I think part of it is also to do with the fact that I quite like slasher films. And as Jonathan said, this is probably the most slasher-ish of the Hellraiser franchise. I quite like it. I enjoy the sort of meta commentary. I thought this one actually had a little bit of humor. It works for me all the way up until the point where Henry Cavill dies and we're left with the 2 leads, and then they're just running around screaming, acting like idiots, and then we get that really terrible Saw-inspired twist, which doesn't make any sense. So it's like 2/3 of the way there, and I would definitely rewatch this film.
Which, by the way, when Henry Cavill dies and I realized we're down to our last 2 people, I looked and I saw there were 30 minutes left. You have to be kidding me.
Yeah,
how can
that's
that
when you
possibly
groan.
be 30 minutes? Yes, exactly. But yeah, it's you got to love it for its ridiculousness. At least I do. I think I'm in the same boat with you, Joe. I think this is probably my favorite of the group, just because, if nothing else, the quasi industrial goth music playing the early 2000s.
Yeah.
It's delightfully bad. But also I found myself I think I kind of, despite myself, find myself liking some of these songs. But yeah, it was fun, which is kind of something that you can't say for some of these later entries.
Yeah, more of them end up being slogs, and this one feels like a bit of... Yeah, it's just kind of amusing in a lot of ways. And I kind of like that they also drop the conceit that this has anything to do with video games as soon as they get to the mansion, because this film clearly doesn't know what it's talking about when it comes to online playing games.
Yeah, I think they probably okay, let's hurry up and get past this. Let's make sure that people don't understand that we have no idea what we're talking about. We'll get someone to throw a couple graphics on a computer and we'll call it a day.
Yeah, is the guy who did Lawnmower Man available? Because I like those graphics.
Which, by the way, that kind of brings up the topic of, I think, one of the biggest areas where these movies suffer, and this is just a budgetary constraint, is the CGI in this. And any of the other ones are so bad. It's painful. Like when you go, especially if you think about a scene like the original Hellraiser, where Frank/Larry gets ripped in half, and they kind of keep trying to bring that idea back. Deader was so the bad one where it I can't even describe it. It was just, it looked like someone had done it on MS Paint or something like that. But it's also one of those things where you can't drag them too hard for that, just because I'm sure they were working with, about a $17 budget for both of these movies. So you got to give them some slack on that, but it was definitely noticeable. We'll say that.
I think my complaint is more the fact that their budgetary constraint, I think, matched with the shooting schedule, where it's you've got 2 weeks to film this movie. It means that they can't embrace the ingenuity that can come with independent filmmaking or low budget filmmaking. Not every single one of these films has to use the fucking chains that come out of the wall. You could try something different, but instead...
obsessed with the chains.
at least they did bring something, again, going back to Hellworld, they brought something a little bit different with Lance's big finish. Instead of the chains, they've got those swinging axes. They're on chains, but at least instead of hooks, they've got kind of those scythes at the end. So that made for an interesting kind of way to mix it up. Now, again, the CGI was not great, but at least it was something a little bit different. So I think that's going to bring us to what I think is pretty universally regarded as the worst of the bunch when it comes to these movies, and I think it has as much to do with kind of the backstory and the production as it does the actual the product. The stars Stephen Brand, Nick Eversman, Tracy Fairway, Sebastian Roberts, and the synopsis: two friends discover a puzzle box in Mexico which unleashes Cenobite Pinhead. They just kind of get right to it. So this one for me, actually, I've been talking first the whole time, so let's start with somebody else. Jonathan, why don't you kick us off?
Oh, of course. I'll take the honor. Thank you.
Take it away, Jonathan.
Yeah. So I guess this is one of those that I guess kind of goes against what I was saying, where I don't even think the story is necessarily all that great here. We know that production was super rushed, and more than the script, because we know, Doug Bradley's game for some of these other stories. So I was like, initially I was like, well, like really, what was the problem? Like, why wouldn't he do this when he did, all the others? And it was more from what I read about the, production schedule and how quickly this thing got rushed, where he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't have time to prep or to read it or to really understand what you're trying to do here. And I think that, to be honest, if Doug Bradley had been back in this movie, it probably wouldn't have the rep that it does. Yeah. I don't think this movie overall, and especially given budgetary and time restraints, is all that bad. It actually feels a little more Hellraiser-y than some of the other movies, So I would, if this had Doug Bradley, I would definitely watch this more than I did. I think, it's definitely, the guy that had playing Pinhead was Stephen Smith Collins. He just does not have that like Pinhead face. It is like, it's drastically jarring, and that's not his fault completely. It's not completely the makeup. It can also be, the lighting, the angle that he's filmed from, but it just wasn't done in a way that was appealing, again, because they were rushed, and we get this really weird looking Pinhead, which we've seen in countless memes, and it just kind of takes you out of the movie. And so I guess that's my biggest takeaway from this.
And I know he gets a lot of grief because people call him Fat Pinhead, which, he's a bigger guy under the latex. Most of the people doing the Cenobite work need to be like the skinniest of the skinny. Otherwise, they're going to look bulky. Doug Bradley is a pretty skinny guy. At least he was when he first started doing the Hellraiser franchise. The thing that really threw me off, and I don't mean this as a dig on the guy's appearance, but he's got a little bit of an underbite. And for me, like, part of what makes Pinhead is kind of that like air of sophistication, that kind of erudite, bored with it all attitude, which for me, part of that is that little bit of Doug Bradley overbite. You kind of get that British little flair to it. Yeah. Him having an underbite just completely undercut any kind of like Pinhead menace that was supposed to be there. It just completely threw me off. And again, like it's not that it's like way out of bounds. It's not like the guy has a huge like bulldog underbite, but it was enough to be noticeable in this role. And for whatever reason, since it was wrapped around a crappy movie anyway, it just made it all that much worse. Annie, what are your thoughts on this one?
Oh boy. It's blessedly short. I really don't have a lot to say about this one. Like, Doug Bradley not being Pinhead, I don't have any qualms with the other guy's appearance. It's, it's not Doug Bradley. So yeah, I'm sorry. That's really all I have to say.
That's really okay. I totally get it. But Joe, you're going to have to pick up the slack. I want 10 to 15 minutes on Revelations from you, starting now. Go.
Here's the thing. I feel like I could give it because this was a surprise positive for me. And I don't know if that just means that I lose a bunch of cred among everybody who's listening and you folks. This one felt like a bit of a surprise. And I think Jonathan hit it on the head where this is one of the first films since, you could make the argument, maybe Inferno, but probably not. So all the way back to Bloodline, this is the first true original Hellraiser script that we're getting. And I think it has enough components that reminded me of the first and second films in the storyline with, the best friends, and one of them turns out to be more homicidal, and he's willing to kill his friend and put on the skin suit and trade the lives of sex workers in Mexico. I actually found all of that kind of compelling, and it captured me enough to carry me through the bad acting that was taking place in the quote unquote current contemporary timeline with the family, who I thought were abysmal. I'm sorry to those actors, but they were just not good. The other thing that kind of works for this film is I thought the found footage pieces were an interesting way to shake up the formats to give it a bit of a different look. I don't think it's going to be everybody's bag, and they do drop it about halfway through, so it feels like they didn't really want to 100% commit to it. And then the other piece is the makeup. I actually thought the makeup when people were getting skinned was actually pretty good. I didn't think the Cenobite makeup was good at all. So it was like they spent all of their makeup budget on one half of the production and not at all on the other side. And of course, the piece that people are going to fixate on is not Doug Bradley Pinhead, and he looks bad and he's lit badly. And that sinks this movie, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I was actually, when I first saw this movie, I kind of had your same perspective on it, Joe, where I thought in a lot of elements, it was kind of a return to the basics for Hellraiser. It wasn't about the Cenobites. It was about the people and how they were handling trying to get away from the Cenobites. And they were kind of this background threat again. When I went through and watched it again this time, I think what was lost on me was that by seeing that on paper, this was kind of a return to basics for Hellraiser. It also brought up for me all the ways in which it misses the mark with trying to return to basics for Hellraiser. Right. And never mind the fact that this was basically this is a glorified what they call an ashcan print, where they basically, Miramax just did it to keep the rights for Hellraiser so that they could keep the property. They didn't really care about the quality of it. Everybody knew that going in. So I think everybody already went into it just between that and Doug Bradley not being into it. Just, they were going to go into it hating it most likely anyway. Right. So, initially I thought there was some stuff to like, but the last time I saw it, it was more just the attempts at making it more like the original only highlighted how much they didn't understand what made the original so good for me. Right. There was too much hanging out with dude bros, and the trip down to Mexico I thought lasted way too long. I like kind of what became of it, and that was compelling, but just too much time with guys, shoving cameras in their face and being privileged a-holes. It just got old.
Yeah, I mean, these are probably the most despicable lead characters that we've had in the entire franchise. Anytime that you introduce a character to me and he's talking about getting his dick wet, I'm just well, I can't wait to watch you die. Yeah, it felt like this is the crib notes of what Hellraiser did and what made it work so well. And they said, okay, so it's unlikable characters making deals with the devil, getting in over their heads, and then having to barter with legitimately good people to get their way out. And in that way, it does work. But you're absolutely right. If you compare it to the original, oh God, it's terrible. Yeah.
All right. Anybody got anything else on Revelations before we move on to our final installment?
Nope.
A resounding no. Okay.
So we just all really want to talk about Judgment, I think.
Definitely. So that brings us to 2018's Judgment. And this one was written and directed by Gary Tunnicliffe, who has been kind of in the Hellraiser universe since part 3. He started off doing a lot of the effects work through, I think he's done the effects for pretty much every installment since 3. And he got his chance here to to. He wrote, I think, the initial script for Revelations, but then they chopped it up. He was not happy with what they did with the final product for Revelations. So this one, he really had, from what I can tell, complete creative control. The movie starred Damon Carney, Randy Wayne, Alexandra Harris, Gary Tunnicliffe, and Paul T. Taylor took the reins as Pinhead in this one. The synopsis, Detective Sean and David Carter are on the case to find a gruesome serial killer terrorizing the city. Joining forces with Detective Christine Edgerton, they dig deeper into a spiraling maze of horror that may not be of this world. Joe, I know you watched this one just last night, so I'd like to hand it off to you and have you kick us off.
Okay, so I saw Judgment when it first came out on VOD, and I hated it. It was probably one of the worst films I saw in all of 2018. So I was not eager to revisit this, and I actually found that I enjoyed it more than I expected on the rewatch. But what really stuck out to me is everything to do with the cops is basically Hellseeker and Inferno all over again, and it sucks. Like, it's just absolutely terrible, and I couldn't care less. Everything to do with the introductions of new mythology. So the editor, the new Cenobites, the way that they're processing the judgments in, the Ludovico house. All of that is actually kind of interesting. It's absolutely disgusting, and it makes me think that the creators, like Tunnicliffe, I think he actually mistakenly believes that what people want from this franchise is both gore and also gross out. Like, I don't need to see someone barfing in the first 5 minutes of this movie.
Yeah, it's actually the opposite end of what makes the original Hellraiser so compelling. It's that mix of beauty and gore. It's elegant, it's symmetrical, there's an art to it. This is
just disgusting.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So it's weird because I get really defensive when people talk about how much they love Pinhead and the Cenobites in the franchise, because to me, what makes Hellraiser work is its compelling characters in the first 4 films, well, maybe 3 films, and then there's Bloodline, which has interesting stuff but not great characters. And I'm actually the opposite with this film. So I'm going against myself with Judgment, because I feel like had this film been entirely about the team doing the judgments with the editor and all these other guys, and this battle between heaven and hell that just randomly pops up in the last 5 minutes of this movie, I think Judgment could have been a legitimately fascinating entry into the canon. But instead, we have to wade through like 120 minutes of this shitty cop drama, and I just don't care.
Yeah, the last thing, anything new Hellraiser, I just beg whoever's making it, take out the police procedural element. We don't need it. I don't want it. It is boring, and it just does not add anything to the conversation. And I agree with you, Joe, in terms of like the nod to the kind of expanding the world. It's also a nod to a little bit of kind of the inner workings of the Scarlet Gospels in terms of the last Pinhead-related book that Clive Barker did. He started getting into some of the machinations in hell. There's a lot of that in some of the different comic book series. So there's fertile ground there, and it looks like they were trying to start alluding to that, but anchoring it to that, we don't need a Hellraiser whodunit. That's not what anybody's looking for, I don't think.
No. And it's a shame, because this film, I think, was the intended kickoff to like more films that would explore those elements. But of course, they were only doing it once again because they wanted to keep the rights. And it looks like this will all be jettisoned when we get the new entries.
Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think that my first comment when I had watched it, my wife Christy, and we were kind of perplexed and also enjoying it. I mean, we do love this series as much as we are frustrated by it. It's that this was like a pilot, right? Like that they finally started getting into something good, and I'm like, and now we need the next 10 episodes of the TV series, because it definitely felt like that. Gary Tunnicliffe is really working with some interesting ideas. I kind of have to give him credit, and I'm at least happy for him, because when we look at like all of these movies, I mean, this is a guy who's been working on the effects. He's kind of seen how things are mishandled, and he's like, well, I want to take my swing with this, and he does, and he turns out something. I mean, again, given the fact that there was probably, he may have had more creative control, but still, as Dimension's known for, he probably had a lot of notes and edits, and it has to have a police story, or you have to do this in it. So
you have to have three chicks with their boobs out getting covered in blood.
Exactly. So, kind of understanding that, I do agree with the comment that I think he misses the mark in terms of like going for like that shock factor or gore. And I don't think we need that. And I do agree that we need the character development. So I don't think this is flawless by any means, but I think it steps better than most of the other, films that we've talked about today. And, like I said, as a TV series, I think it would have worked. And also, I guess, talking about the new Pinhead, Paul T. Taylor, I thought he did a pretty good job of, he kind of, in my mind, he accomplished what you were talking about, Bryan, is that he does, I think it's a mixture of both, better lighting, better makeup, a better actor, but also, and the costuming I thought was pretty good, because it was different here, where it makes him feel more like a high priest overseeing all of this.
Yes.
I did like Pinhead, the idea of Pinhead having that kind of rank within hell, or within, this world, because it does gel with the Scarlet Gospels, and that I'm dying to see somebody kind of really, dive into. So I'm a little sad we're not going to get more. I'm more excited that we're getting 2 separate attempts coming up soon, because the movie's going to go one way. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there is some confusion exactly what rights and how that's going to work with the TV show. I did see one report that said it was going to stay in canon. And if it does it follow Judgment? Does it just follow the original films? Does it just follow Hellraiser 3? So I'm kind of curious to see what they end up doing with it.
We got to get some Halloween style, like parallel universe shenanigans, where there's going to be these tangents where you get, the 4, 5, and 6. You get the H2O. You get the H40. We're going to start seeing that with the Hellraiser franchise, maybe.
We get all 3 Pinheads to show up.
Oh, jeez.
Interesting.
Annie, Judgment. What is your? I can't believe I'm doing this.
No.
Your judgment on the film? Yep, I did it. Walked right into it.
Yeah, so when I asked my roommate's girlfriend about this movie, because she's the only other person I know who has actually seen this, I asked her like, what's up with that one? What am I in for with that one? And she was like, well, in the beginning, this guy throws up like into a funnel, and like these sexy Cenobite ladies eat it. And I was like, well, that sounds kind of hot. And she was like, no. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I find it very moralizing. Part of what I like about the early Hellraiser movies, and part of what I love about the book, the Hellbound Heart, is this ambiguous morality and this ambiguous larger world building. Like there's not a lot of backstory as to why the Cenobites are the way they are, or what exactly their goals are, besides the pursuit of pleasure and pain mingling together. And that is compelling to me. What's not so compelling to me is this like kind of Abrahamic Christian element that gets brought in through the series. So that's my biggest criticism of this, like beyond any of the like actual visual things that are happening in this movie, just like how untrue it is to what I love about Hellraiser. And yeah, I would agree with all of you that I don't know why this franchise became so obsessed with cop procedurals, but I don't think anybody likes it. So yeah, like enough of that. So yeah, that's my I think that's all I have to say about that movie.
All right. Well, understandable. And so, yeah, I know, we've touched on the fact that it's probably not going to be at least until the second episode, and then probably deeper into the first one, where Annie will really get a chance to shine with her background. But in order to get there, I think we all needed to trudge through the mud for this episode. So just a few things to kind of discuss to kind of wrap things up. And I think I know the answer to this. The reputation for these films, would you say it's deserved? And before we do that, I just want to play a very quick game. Of the 5 movies we watched, which one do you think had the lowest Rotten Tomato score? Jonathan, which one do you think?
I say it's Revelations because of the lack of Doug Bradley.
Okay. Annie?
I was going to go with Revelations as well.
And Joe?
I was inclined to say the same, but I might go with Hellworld.
You are all incorrect. It was Hellseeker with a big fat goose egg. It has a 0%. Now, granted, it's only got 7 reviews, but that means only 7 people were willing to review that movie in the first place. Revelations just eked out with a 6. I think Judgment might have been the highest one, if I remember correctly. Yeah, that one had a 50%. There are definitely some people who have a soft spot for that one. Hellworld only had 20. Deader had 17.
Okay.
Suffice to say, with a 50% being the highest, it's not well received. And I think I'm not even going to put it as a question. I think we can all agree that that's pretty much a deserved reputation, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. It's a real slog.
Yeah.
Especially when you're watching them back to back, like you're really starting to see the seams and the limitations of where the direct-to-video elements pushed it, like the lack of budget, the inability to give the prosthetics and the makeup quite the attention it needs. These films, I think, suffer as a result. So it's hard to consider them true Hellraiser films because they feel like cheap knockoffs.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, Hellraiser, the Pinhead costume just gets cheaper and cheaper, except for maybe in the last one.
Yeah, like it's Party City stuff here.
Yeah.
And the last one takes a weird turn in terms of the chest appliance.
I was just going to say that.
It looks completely different than the way he has up until that movie. Jonathan, do you know what's up with that one? What the decision was behind that?
I have no idea about the decision, but I don't know why they did that. It's clearly a plate, where it looks like it, where you can see the ribs that don't kind of fit exactly the right way. I mean, I don't have the backstory for it, but I would have just covered that up.
So there's the obvious reasons as to why these don't work. The budget, just kind of churning them out as more of a way to make a quick buck than really putting kind of the effort into the quality of them. Oftentimes not necessarily because of the people who were the creative forces, Gary Tunnicliffe, you can tell he cares about these movies. He's not trying to make bad Hellraiser movies. So, the studio has so much to do with kind of the drop. But what is it in particular about this franchise that the fall from grace seems just so far? Because every franchise, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the farther they went on, the less money they had to work with, and arguably the worse they got. But there's another franchise, one of my favorite franchises ever, is Phantasm, and it suffered from the same exact things where the budget was severely cut. It went direct to video. But I think the one saving grace for Phantasm is that the creative force behind it, Don Coscarelli, kind of had the reins pretty much the entire way through. So what is it about Hellraiser that this fall seems to hurt so particularly bad? Is it just because we love it so much, or do you think there's something more to that?
I mean, I can jump in on that one, and I'll just say that, I think that it always feels, regardless of the situation, it feels icky when, something, whether by force or through business deals, is kind of taken away from the original creator and exploited for profit. And I think that that's kind of the thing is that we see Clive Barker, this visionary. We've seen some of his other movies, and and regardless of the box office success, like we know he's a true artist. And to then see what the Weinsteins and Dimension did when they have the rights, and there are people that care about these movies. Doug Bradley clearly cares about playing Pinhead, and he takes the time. There are people who are working hard on this, and they care about the work they're putting out, but it's being released for reasons of just holding on to the rights, the minimum viable product, so that I can retain these rights so it does not go back to the original creators. That feels kind of scummy. And so I think that's why, for me, that hurts a little bit more, because I think, even with something, how much I love the Alien franchise, and, we get bad installments, but we got bad installments, in my opinion, from, the guy who originally, helped create, and directed the first movie. So if he, stumbles, it's like, well, that's his art. It's his decision. Whereas this feels much more like product.
Yeah, I'll take that ball and run with it. I think because the other thing is, it's not just the loss of that creative voice, or even something that helps to streamline or pass a through line through all of these films. Like, at least with Alien, it feels like they're telling stories, right? Like, that's what we're seeing in other franchises. We've got a fixture. Here, Pinhead has never been that central draw, right? Like, he is the antagonist who shows up, but we don't have anybody else to help keep this franchise contained. And I think the Weinsteins and Dimension and Miramax, their lack of ambition and willing to support this franchise financially meant that they were willing to compromise the integrity and the intelligence of it. So they were willing to just take shitty film noir scripts and throw Hellraiser components into it. And that doesn't work. Like, you're only going to get subpar, mediocre entries as a result. And that's often what we ended up getting.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. And it feels scummy when you're watching them. And it feels tacked on, and it's, beyond all the obvious reasons they're not good films, like with the budget or a poor script or whatever. Right. The acting, they're also not good because they're not true to the essence of Hellraiser. And they're, Pinhead becoming the central villain doesn't work for me, because I think that the Cenobites altogether are part of the draw of why the first one is so fascinating.
Yeah, and the second one.
And the second one, yeah, I really like the second one too, and I even like the third one. But I mean, we'll talk about that later. But it becomes this slasher thing instead of this very intelligent exploration into an existential question, which is why it doesn't work for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a pretty good way to wrap it up. I do want to do just one thing, just because, most of this episode has been us using these movies as a punching bag. So I would like to end on one positive note and just go around the table and say one thing that this series does get right. Let's see. Let's go with Annie. I'll let you go first, just because there's so few things. I feel like, whoever goes last is going to really have slim pickings. So I'll let you go first.
Oh, God. I mean, I keep going back to Deader, and I think I do kind of like the early 2000s cyberpunk camp element of these movies.
Yes.
Like, I don't know if that's a true positive, because I'm saying that it's camp. For me, it's a positive, because if we're going to have something that is bad, I think it should be so bad that it becomes entertaining. And that's when it veers into like complete over the top camp, I think that's when they're the most successful.
And we're definitely going to talk about that again, come Bloodline. So put a pin in that. All right, Joe, how about you?
I think the things that work the best for me is when they take these tentative stabs at embracing and expanding the mythology. So as I mentioned, I kind of like the idea of the cult in Deader, and I like the ideas at the end of Judgment with, I mean, I agree with you, Annie. I don't like how it becomes like a black and white dichotomy and it's very Christian. I didn't love that part, but I do like the idea that there is something more, like the Cenobites are part of something grander and larger, and there's a conflict that we don't get to see as human beings. So I like these little tentative attempts to broaden some of that out. And I say that if only because some of these human characters have been so bland and uninteresting that it makes me appreciate the supernatural, otherworldly elements a little bit more.
Jonathan, how about you?
I think these, especially this batch of movies, I think really shows how incredible a world and character in Pinhead that Clive Barker and Doug Bradley, created, that we're willing to watch these like diminishing returns, significantly diminishing returns, just for a glimpse of that magic that they were able to capture in that first film. Yeah. Just hoping that that someone else is able to do it. And I guess it leaves me hopeful that there's, again, so many great ideas, again, in those original films that, somebody's going to do it. We might have had to have suffered, for the last, 20 years or so, and maybe we'll have to suffer another 10, but whether it's in this TV show or another film, I think somebody's going to crack it. I think part of that is you need to get people who are interested in telling, really character-driven stories, and people who don't, think that Pinhead is a slasher. And I think also, we need to make sure we're very inclusive and realize why Clive Barker and why Hellraiser was important to begin with. So anyway, I guess it leaves me hopeful.
And I will cap off with, I do want to give some recognition to Gary Tunnicliffe. He gets ragged on quite a bit for writing Revelations and writing and directing Judgment, and they're definitely flawed movies, both in the script and in how it was executed. But it's also clear that he loves this franchise. And as an effects artist, the one good thing that to the best of his ability he's been able to maintain is when it comes to the practical effects, there are good practical and makeup effects throughout. Sometimes they're overshadowed by some shoddy CGI, but I don't know how much he has to do with that side of it. So I appreciate his willingness to stay on board this Hellraiser ship since part 3. So he's there for 20 plus years at this point, and willing to keep coming back and kind of really put his all into whatever work he's doing with these movies, even if sometimes the people around him aren't necessarily doing that. So one thing I will give a nod to is he did if you look on YouTube, he actually has a short film. It's called No More Souls, I believe. And I think it's like an Easter egg, or it's a special feature on one of the DVDs. I think it might be Deader. It's just like a 4 or 5 minute film. And it's a premise of like, what happens to Pinhead and the Cenobites when there are no more souls to harvest? Because I think the premise is that there was like a nuclear holocaust on planet Earth, and everybody's dead. And it was kind of this big Cenobite party as they were introducing everybody at first, but after several millennia, he's got nothing to do. And I just think like that hints at there's definitely something to Tunnicliffe that, I think if given more of an opportunity, I think there's something there. Or maybe it's just the fact that it's only 4 or 5 minutes long. I'm not sure, but I definitely recommend checking that out. It's on YouTube. I thought it was really interesting. So I think with that's going to wrap up the Inferno. We're going to be coming around next month with our next installment, which is going to be Purgatory. We'll be talking about Hell on Earth, Bloodline, and Inferno. But before we go, Annie, where can we find you to keep up with your comings and goings online?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at girlsgutsgiallo. And you can find my Patreon at patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. I do a lot of live streaming and writing and bonus episodes. So yeah, check it out. And you can listen to Girls Guts Giallo wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Definitely do that. Joe.
So I am available at on Instagram at bstolemyremote, and that's the letter B. And if you want to follow Horror Queers, we also have our own Instagram and Twitter, and that's just at Horror Queers. And new episodes come out every Wednesday wherever you find your podcasts.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. With that, another episode of Corpse Club comes to an end. We want to thank Bryan, our engineer, for helping us out every episode. And as always, we want to thank our listeners, including those of you who have signed up for Corpse Club memberships. Be sure to visit corpseclub.com. Check out our latest episode. You can also sign up to become a member, and you can get T-shirts, cards, pins. You'll also get access to members-only content. I do a bunch of really dopey commentary episodes, usually with Scott, but there's even one sneaking around on there that I did with Joe a few months back. So definitely check those out if you can. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Every rating and review helps. You can also find us on Google Play, SoundCloud, and all your favorite podcast providers. If you want to get in touch, reach us anytime at contact@corpseclub.com or on Twitter at Daily Dead News or at Corpse Club, and on Instagram and Facebook under Corpse Club. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay scary.